had to learn that too. So, hello and welcome. I'm Reverend Debbie Bergio, and today we are joined by my good friend and colleague, Reverend Dr. Lynne Humphries Russ. We are going to be talking about oral histories, what they are, and why they are so important. Lynne, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Debbie, and thank you for the work that you're doing with your organization. It is truly wonderful, and that you would be interested in oral histories for your people is wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in oral histories and where that has led you.
I became interested in oral histories because I had to learn how to listen better. And I wanted to find out what the skills were that required somebody to listen better. As a singer, I was a professional singer. I could talk a whole lot and I could let other people hear me, but I really thought I needed to learn to listen better. So I went to the organization that I found taught listening skills more than any other skill, that they listened to people and were able to then take what the people were saying and really hear them and be able to work with their stories, because story is an important part of oral history, as you can imagine. And story has always been important to me from a professional and a personal place. So I went and I learned how to do oral histories through the Oral History Association, which is a national organization, and the Oral History Mid-Atlantic region, which is just in this area. Got very involved with it and did a number of oral history projects in this area, in Howard County, in Annapolis, and then in the state. But I then took those skills and put them to work in ministry. As I was called to ministry during this time, I found that those listening skills were really vital in the ministry. And I have been able to use them.
That's fantastic. So now what is an oral history? I mean, that sounds like a silly question, but what are the basics of an oral history?
That's a complex question, because it depends on how an oral history is going to be used. I've done oral histories of my mother. I've done oral histories of my grandfather, but those were ones that I needed to use for me, for my own genealogical research, for my family research. But I've then, as I said, done oral history projects, and that's a different animal. The oral history project has to have a very specific goal and parameters around which it's developed and around which those oral histories are then developed. When you're doing it for your personal use, you know the person usually that you're doing it for, that you're working with. And so you have to be kind of careful about not anticipating the answers, really listening to what it is that they're saying and letting them have their say without stepping on their words and stepping on their meanings, all of that. And yet, by the same token, you know a lot of their story. So you might be able to let it spur things on. If you can give them ideas of well, I seem to remember it this way, why is it different that you're thinking of it differently than I did,
Okay.
Or they're a way truly for us to get at the meaning and the story of each individual person that's being interviewed.
I know that we agree in this. I'm anticipating a little bit here myself since we've talked before, but I truly believe, and I know that you do, that every person's story is important. We hear so much about the famous, the popular people, but every individual story is important.
I think they're sometimes more important, most times more important than the famous and the celebrities, because they're the bulk, the foundation of life. And, I'm going to get on my pulpit here a little bit.
Please do. Please do.
Jesus came to tell us that the ordinary is extraordinary. And oral histories elevate an individual's story to the extraordinary. The funny thing is that I have not had anybody who has thought that their story was really important enough to be interviewed about. I've never had anybody who was thought that was true. Even people like I interviewed the first African American teacher and administrator in Anne Arundel County, and they understood how vital their position was, but it was their position and their story. It was just their story, not something that impacted that position as much, but it did. It does. It just really does. Everybody's story is vital.
Is it kind of a cathartic experience, or is it, I mean, if you're sharing it, if you're doing it for yourself, say I wanted to do an oral history with you about me, is it
with me as the interviewer?
Yes. Like, or you're doing, I like what you talk about. You did one for your mom, so you could share it with your family for genealogical purposes. People really, it helps to bring up memories and thoughts and kind of look at their life view or worldview.
For the interviewee. Yeah, for the interviewee, it can be very cathartic. I did an oral history of a woman in one of my congregations who had lost her husband, had lost her son, and she had never really confronted, even though she was very emotional about it, about both of those losses in her life, she had never really confronted the emotions of it. And so as we were going through the interview, it was amazing how much she really came to terms with those emotions and didn't know that she was going to do that. So yes, it can be cathartic for the interviewee. It can be cathartic for the interviewer as well, depending on who they're interviewing. And the first oral history interview I ever did was my father. And he died when I was 18, which was almost 50 years ago. So that's a long time ago. As I listen to it now, I know how cathartic it was for me at that young age to be interviewing my father, thinking that he was going to pass not long after that. And yeah, it is cathartic, I think, on both sides.
So how does one do an oral history? What is, if you're going to be talking to an individual, I'm thinking more on the individual scale.
If I'm doing it for my personal use, you mean?
Well, that first, and then maybe.
It's not a whole lot different. I think the kinds of questions that you ask, you would ask differently. You have to be able to record it, because you do want to be able to record it so that you can either go back and really hear what you heard, because it's very distracting for a person to be writing something down at the time they're interviewing. It's hard. You have to do some, but you have to be able to be very focused on the person you're interviewing. You have to record. And in my estimation, you have to understand what you're looking for. If you're interviewing your relative, then are you looking for their story? Are you looking for the family story? Are you looking for them in context to the place where they're from or the place where they are? So you have to have an idea of what your goal is in this. And then develop the questions around that goal so that you're clear when you go into that interview about what the questions are. It's up to you whether you feel it's important to give those questions to the interviewee beforehand or not. Depends on what your goal is from it. it might be very respectful of them to do that, to give them the questions.
Sure.
But there could be a reason for you not to as well. That would be completely up to the situation. It's important to know how, as I said, to really listen. When you're getting the answers from things, to know, to hear what it is that's being said and be able to respond in kind so that you can really hear it. It's very telling for an oral historian not to listen, because when you hear the recording or you see the video of it, you can tell when they're not listening. You can tell, and
I'm sure
they'll have missed something very big, and not be able. I mean, if you have somebody who all of a sudden will say that they were in a major battle in the Second World War, and you didn't know that, and you gloss over it when they say that, somebody's sitting, that the only thing that somebody's thinking as they're hearing it is, well, what was that battle? And what did they do? And what happened? And, how did that affect them today? And, it colors the rest of the interview.
That's an excellent point, because and also I imagine as an interviewer, and I'm probably doing it right now thinking, okay, what's the next question I'm going to ask? So you miss hearing what you're talking about, what the person's talking about while you're formulating your next question.
Which is why it's important to have them for you as the interviewer written down.
Absolutely.
To have them in front of you and be clear about what they are before you go into the interview.
So you're recording, this is an oral history. And I guess interviews can last any length of time. Is there like a guideline, or just you start and you go until?
Depends on the questions you want to ask and how long you want it to be, how long the person that's being interviewed can take. If they're younger, it's a little different than if they're elderly. So, or if they're abled or handicapped in some way, disabled in some way, you want to be able to respond to their needs.
In general, do you focus, I guess everyone's individual, but focus on like a certain part of someone's life? Like maybe you're talking about their various careers, or you might be talking about their family, all the places they've lived, you do.
You can. I mean, that's really up to what your goal is.
Okay.
How you want to, what this is for, what your intent is.
Okay. So how does this all relate maybe to our spiritual lives? Because I imagine a lot of the work that you've done, you're talking about in ministry, as a tool, helping you to listen in ministry, but also as part of your ministry. What benefits have you seen for people who have an oral history about them done or participate in it?
My doctoral work is on story within these two congregations in which I serve. And I came at it to do an oral history project because I stood in one of our annual conferences and saw so much conflict that was going on in the conference with people who have been taught as United Methodists to think and let think. Those were John Wesley's words, and yet they were not allowing each other to have their opinions. And there was just such conflict, and all I could see were stories that were not going to be told because of it. And so I wanted to be able to tell the stories. And as I focused on that and found out that there are no oral histories in our archives at all, I thought this was a pertinent project to do. In my doctoral work then, which was about leadership and engagement with the world, we found how much the idea of people's self-image and their identity used to be discovered through the church. And with the real change that's happening in the demographics in churches in congregations all over, not just our denomination, but all over the world, that people are finding other ways to create their identities, to really form those identities. And it doesn't necessarily have God in with that. Mm-hmm. And I know how vital that is, that there's a whole chapter of the book that's not being written if you don't have God in there. Actually, I'd say the covers are not there. You've got a formless book if you don't have God in the midst of that. And so I wanted to know how the identity was being created in these two churches that are legacy churches with legacy families that are in a very foundational area of the country. This was a place where in the 1700s, what's called the Bush Declaration was written, which was one of the declarations before the Declaration of Independence was written. Mm-hmm. So this was a foundational place. And I had the idea that many of these families were probably families that had come through the generations from those people. And in my discovery, I found out I was right. And how those stories impact today was really important to me, especially because this area is the family home of John Wilkes Booth. And I wondered how these churches were, what their role was and what the church's families' roles were in abolition, in slavery, just what that was because of all the conflict we're finding in our society today and how we're dealing with that. And I have found out a great deal that these two churches were Methodist Protestant churches, and they chose to be Methodist Protestant churches at a time in the 1820s through 60s when slavery just was rampant here in this county. And obviously that John Wilkes Booth came up. And the reason...
What's the significance of Methodist Protestant?
That they were abolitionists.
Okay.
They were
as opposed to the Methodist Episcopal who were not. Okay.
They were not. And the Methodist Protestant churches, the one that started in 1826 was the man who built it, actually built it from bricks that he fired. He gave his children the decision to whether to become Methodist Protestant or Methodist Episcopal, and they chose Methodist Protestant. Mm-hmm. Then when this church was built, when the church, the second congregation in 1866, so the year after the Civil War, they incorporated as a Methodist Protestant church. And this area, not only was it that slavery was a large part of the farming community here, but it also had 4 trails of the Underground Railroad that came through it, came to it as a nexus that then jumped off to Pennsylvania. So it was a really important part, and nobody talks about it, Debbie. Mm-hmm. Nobody talks about it. And so and as I said, John Wilkes Booth grew up here, and his family was here until after the Civil War. And one of the families in this congregation traces back to the Booths. Wow. So it's definitely something that is still a part of the fabric, and now John Wilkes was the only slavery proponent. All the rest of the family were abolitionists.
Okay.
And where did he get that from? He got that from the farmers in the area. Yeah. That's where they attribute his radical thoughts to. So it's really fascinating how this story from 150 years ago impacts today.
Absolutely.
And what does that mean then to people's understanding about the Black Lives Matter issues and about how we should reconcile, and just what does that mean? This is a very homogenous society still. This culture is still only 4% African American. And what does that mean to us as we're going forward in the Methodist Church with a possible schism? What does that mean? It impacts us.
Absolutely. And for even beyond the Methodist Church, it just shows the stories of the places where people grew. I mean, the people make the stories of where they are, but
yes,
that synergy there and the generational impact it has wherever that place may be has such a generational impact on relationships and individuals and families.
And the creation of identity. Mm-hmm. That was the point at which that was the beginning point, is how does our story create our identity, and vice versa. It's a symbiotic relationship, but yeah.
Absolutely. And then for people to be able to share their stories, maybe delve into their own stories, and maybe in ways that they hadn't really focused on or taken the time to remember and understand, how we can understand each other. And my story is obviously different from yours, is different from everybody Absolutely. We're going to meet. And based on past experiences and how understanding each other, even if we disagree or have our differences, being able to understand each other's stories can help that reconciliation of all kinds of relationships.
Think and let think. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. Yeah, a good example of understanding things differently came in my grandfather's oral history. When my mother's family were coal miners in southwestern Pennsylvania, and my father's family were coal mine owners in southwestern Pennsylvania. And my father's family owned some of the mines that my mother's family worked in. Mm-hmm. So in the 1920s, that was not a pleasant relationship. And my parents married in 1950, but in the 20s, and 30s, that was a very conflicted relationship. And I asked my grandfather, the coal miner, what it was like whenever the coal mine owners would come into what was called the coal mine patch, the town that the owners had created in order to have a place for all the miners to live when they worked in their mines. So I said, Granddad, how did you react whenever the coal mine owner would come into town? He said, Lenny, I would look at them and turn my back and walk away, because they would pick a black man over a white man any day because they could work him to death. And that was wrong. Mm. And as I heard that, my grandfather was a very fair man. And yet I don't think he understood that he was saying that that's the kind of ideology my father's family had grown with, that they were the ones doing that. Mm-hmm. And I understood then the true dichotomy of what I was raised in by interviewing my grandfather. So that's the kind of catharsis and difference it can make in our individual identity to do an oral history. So, I mean, I knew my grandfather was a very fair man, that he grew, because the patch had people from all over the world and all kinds of people whose continuing their binding thread was the kind of hard work and poverty that they lived in. Mm-hmm. And so they felt more, they felt closer together as humans. They really did. And yet he didn't see that, what he was saying about the difference in this economic stratus that was happening in our family. Mm-hmm.
So if someone wants to have an oral history done about themselves, or first you said we need a recording, what are some of the tools or some of the steps that you would suggest maybe people could think about that they could take to do an oral history?
Zoom.
Yes,
we
absolutely.
have been handed this application over the pandemic that has just been an incredible tool. Mm-hmm. It's whenever I was faced with having created this project and everything being shut down, I had to figure out how to do this project and get my doctorate in the timely manner that I expected. And Zoom made it possible. Had it not been for Zoom, I wouldn't have been able to do it. So I would say Zoom is the best thing that people can use because you can
Yes.
see each other from a distance, and
Mhm.
you can manipulate it if you needed to. If you needed to cut something out, or you can do that too. It's really a wonderful tool. You can use your phones. We are blessed with our phones too.
Yes.
It used to be really hard to do all of that. One thing about Zoom that was really very useful for me is that if you have a professional level of Zoom, you can also get transcripts. It has to be through the enterprise level
Oh,
of
okay.
Zoom.
Okay.
And you can get transcripts of everything. And because I was working at a seminary at that time, I was able to get transcripts of everything. And that made it was really a wonderful addition to what I.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I
Otherwise,
know.
you need to do transcripts. That's why I'm saying that.
Okay, that's really good to know. I know a year ago when I was doing an interview for the fair with a vendor, she was concerned that I was going to come and interview her in person and was uncomfortable with that at the time. And I said, honestly, I wouldn't have any idea how to interview you and record it if we did it in person. It had to be on Zoom. And she's like, oh, okay, great. So this technology is amazing that we're able
It
to use for
is.
this.
It is. And it just we're all used to it now too.
Mhm.
In January of 2020, I had to start teaching a class where I had to use Zoom, and I had never used it.
Yeah.
And I was just, the night before I had to teach it, I was beside myself. How am I going to do this? I don't know. Oh my gosh. By March, I had to use Zoom on a regular basis. And
Zoom Pro.
it's really incredible. It's
So
incredible.
I think that's looking at making the most out of a very difficult situation.
Yeah.
We're using new tools. So what else do we need to? Are there any other things that you would suggest that we need to do to prepare? We talked about trying to think about the topic that we want to center on, having questions maybe ahead of time to think through or not, depending on the situation,
Mhm.
and then just free flowing of conversation.
And listening, really truly
Listening, just
listening,
listening
knowing,
skills.
yeah, what it is that you're hearing and being able to respond to that. And then what you're going to do with it. You know, you always need to be respectful of the person who's being interviewed and make certain that what they're saying is okay for you to do whatever you want to do with it. That they,
Absolutely.
and you might want them to sign a release, depending on whether it's for personal reasons or for professional reasons. If
Hmm.
you're going to donate it to anybody, you need to have some kind of a release, unless the person has passed. You have to have a release form signed.
Okay, that's good to
Um,
know. And like just like a simple basic like a storage tool. Do you um, how do you store? Do you use the thumb drives or just
um,
you just have the files in an
it's all
archive?
digital. It's all digital
All
now.
digital, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think the first person who had stored oral histories at Wesley's library. They had to figure out how to store these oral histories, and
Yes.
whether it needed to be an actual disc. And I was like,
A disc? What's that, Lynn?
right, that's the whole point. Whether a DVD or something. I was like, you know what?
I know.
That's going to be technology that you can't access.
Right.
So they did it digitally. We figured out how to do it digitally and how to get it to them, and all it digitally is the way to go. And I'm sure
Absolutely.
in the future there's going to be something else, but right now that's the way to do it.
That's what we have. Lynn, I just can't thank you enough for sharing your experiences and this something that I think maybe a lot of people haven't thought about being able to do that their oral history, their story is so important.
It is vital.
I
It's
I
vital.
I appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise. And I look forward, we had talked about a workshop that we'll be putting together that people can attend and watch and start working on their own oral history.
Well, thanks for asking me, Debbie. Thanks for doing this work. It's important for people to understand how vital their story is.
I agree completely. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
God bless you.